If your tomatoes in pots keep getting weaker even though you water them regularly, then you may be making the same mistake that I made for many years. Most people think the problem is a lack of fertilizer, so they keep adding more products and spending more money while their plants continue to struggle. What many gardeners do not realize is that the soil inside a container can lose its life long before the plant shows serious signs of trouble. When that happens, the roots stop working as they should, the leaves lose their deep green color, and the harvest becomes smaller with every passing week. I learned this lesson the hard way after watching healthy tomato plants slowly turn into weak plants that produced very little. The strange thing was that I was doing everything people usually recommend. I watered on time, I fed the plants, I checked for pests. Yet the results kept getting worse. That is when I discovered that the real problem was not above the soil, but underneath it. Most people never think about the living part of the soil. They see dirt and nothing more. But once that living system becomes weak, the plant begins to suffer, even if everything else looks correct. Many gardeners over 50 know exactly what I mean because they have seen a pot that started the season strong and then suddenly seemed to stop growing for no clear reason. If this has happened to you, then you are not alone. There is a simple old method that changed everything for me, and it came from a traditional Korean approach that focuses on bringing life back into the soil instead of constantly feeding the plant. The best part is that it does not require expensive products or complicated equipment. Most of the materials are inexpensive and sometimes completely free. When I first heard about it, I was skeptical because it sounded too simple to make a real difference. But after trying it with several containers, I noticed stronger growth, healthier leaves, and better fruit production than I had seen in years. What surprised me most was that the soil itself began to feel different. It stayed balanced longer and seemed to support the plants instead of fighting against them. Very few people talk about this part of container gardening, and that is exactly why so many gardeners keep repeating the same costly mistake season after season. Before I show you the first thing I changed, there is one hidden problem that ruins this method for many people before they even begin. The hidden problem I mentioned is something that almost nobody pays attention to because, at first glance, the soil looks perfectly fine. You water the pot, and the water goes in. The plant is still standing upright. The leaves may even look acceptable from a distance. But beneath the surface, the soil can become tired and compacted, and that is where the trouble begins. I remember one season when my tomatoes looked healthy enough in early summer. Then, little by little, the growth slowed down. New leaves became smaller. Flowers appeared, but many of them dropped before producing fruit. I thought the weather was the problem. Then I blamed the fertilizer. After that, I blamed the variety of tomato. The truth was much simpler. The soil had lost the living activity that helps roots do their job. Most people get this wrong because they focus only on what they can see. They look at leaves and stems while the real story is happening underground. Years ago, an older gardener showed me something that changed the way I looked at every container in my garden. He told me that a pot is not just a place that holds a plant, it is a small world with its own balance. When that balance disappears, the plant starts working harder just to survive. The Korean remedy he shared was not about feeding tomatoes directly. It was about feeding the life inside the soil. That idea seemed strange to me at first because I had spent years thinking only about the plant itself. But once I understood it, everything started making sense. The first step was surprisingly simple. Instead of adding another commercial fertilizer, I started paying attention to the smell and texture of the soil. Healthy living soil has a fresh, natural smell. Tired soil often smells flat or has almost no smell at all. It may also become hard on top and drain poorly. Very few gardeners check these things. Most simply, add more fertilizer and hope for the best. That is why they often spend money without solving the real problem. What happened next surprised me even more. After I started using the old Korean approach, the soil gradually became softer and easier to work with. Water spread more evenly through the container and the roots seemed happier. The tomatoes responded with stronger growth. But that was not the biggest change. There was another result that appeared a little later, and it convinced me that this method was doing something important. When I noticed it for the first time, I knew I would never go back to my old routine again. The change that convinced me was not bigger tomatoes, and it was not faster growth. Those things came later. What caught my attention first was how consistent the plants became. Before that, I was always dealing with ups and downs. One week the tomatoes looked strong, and the next week they seemed stressed for no obvious reason. Many gardeners accept this as normal, but I started noticing that the containers treated with this old Korean method stayed steady. They handled warm days better and recovered faster after changes in weather. That was when I decided to learn more about what was really happening. The remedy itself was surprisingly simple. It used ingredients that many people already have around the house. The key idea was creating a gentle liquid that encouraged life in the soil instead of forcing the plant with strong feeding. An older gardener explained it to me many years ago and told me that most people make a mistake right here. They want quick results and they use too much. This method works best when it is mild and patient. I started with a small container and mixed a simple fermented solution using common kitchen scraps and a little natural sugar. The process was easy and cost almost nothing. That alone made it interesting because many gardeners spend a lot of money every season searching for better harvests. After letting the mixture develop for a short time, I diluted it heavily with water and applied only a small amount around the soil. Not on the leaves, not directly on the fruit, only into the soil where the living activity needed support. Very few people do this because they expect an instant visible change. But here is where things get interesting. During the first few days, nothing dramatic happened. The plants looked almost the same. Many people would stop at that point and assume the method failed. I nearly did the same thing. Then about a week later, I noticed new growth that looked healthier than before. The leaves had a deeper color, and the stems seemed stronger. A little later, the flowers began holding on better instead of dropping. That was the first real sign that something was changing below the surface. The best part was that I was not constantly buying products anymore. The method was simple enough to repeat whenever needed and inexpensive enough for anyone to try. But there was one detail that I almost overlooked. In fact, most gardeners overlook it completely. And if you miss this step, the results can be far weaker than they should be, no matter how good the remedy is. The detail that most people overlook has nothing to do with the remedy itself. It has to do with timing. I learned this after making the same mistake several times. I would prepare the mixture, carefully apply it to the soil, and then expect it to work regardless of the condition of the container. Sometimes the results were excellent, and other times they were only average, and it took me a while to understand why. The older gardener who first showed me this method asked me a simple question. He asked whether the soil was already completely dry when I applied the remedy. I told him that it often was because I usually waited until the plants looked thirsty before watering. He smiled and said that this was where many gardeners lose half the benefit. Living soil responds much better when it already has a little moisture. Completely dry soil is harder for beneficial activity to recover in a balanced way. From that day forward, I changed my routine. A few hours before using the Korean remedy, I lightly watered the container if it was very dry. Then I applied the diluted mixture later when the soil felt evenly moist. The difference was noticeable. The plants seemed to respond more smoothly, and the soil stayed in better condition. Very few people talk about this small step, but it can make a surprisingly large difference. Another thing I discovered was that less is often better. Many gardeners think that if a small amount helps, then a large amount must help even more. I used to think that too, but this method is not about overwhelming the soil. It is about encouraging balance. When I used modest amounts every couple of weeks, the container stayed healthy for much longer. The tomatoes produced steadily, and the plants looked more comfortable throughout the season. Here is where things became even more interesting. I started using the same approach on other container vegetables. Peppers responded well, Cucumbers showed stronger growth. Even plants that had struggled earlier in the season began showing signs of recovery. That caught my attention because it suggested that the method was improving the soil itself rather than helping only one specific crop. Many people spend years searching for a miracle fertilizer when the real answer may be much simpler. A healthy living soil can support many different plants at the same time, but there was still one problem that continued causing trouble in some containers. Once I solved that issue, the results became far more reliable, and the harvest improved in a way I did not expect at all. The problem that still remained in some of my containers was something that many gardeners never connect to poor harvests. At first, I did not connect it either. The plants looked healthy enough, the leaves were green, the stems were strong, yet some pots still produced fewer tomatoes than others. I kept comparing them and looking for differences. The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. The containers that performed poorly often had old soil that had been reused for several seasons without much attention. Many of us do this because it saves money and there is nothing wrong with reusing soil. I still do it today. The mistake is assuming that old soil can support plants year after year without a little help. The Korean remedy brought life back into the soil, but I discovered that it worked even better when I also added a small amount of natural organic material to feed that living system. It did not need to be complicated. Sometimes I used a little homemade compost. Sometimes I added well-aged plant material. The amount was small, but the effect was noticeable. The older gardener who taught me this method said something I never forgot. He told me that living soil is like a good partnership. If you take from it every season without giving something back, eventually the results become weaker. Most people do not realize this because the decline happens slowly. One year the harvest is slightly smaller. The next year, or the plants struggle a little more. By the third season, many gardeners think they need entirely new soil. In some cases, they do not. They simply need to restore what has been lost. This is where things became exciting for me because the containers that had been disappointing for years suddenly started producing much better results. I remember one tomato plant that had barely filled a basket the previous season. After restoring the soil and using the gentle Korean remedy consistently, the same size container produced enough fruit that I was sharing tomatoes with neighbors. That experience convinced me that the condition of the soil matters more than many people realize. The best part was the cost. Instead of buying large amounts of commercial products, I was using simple materials that were inexpensive or already available. That made the method easy to repeat year after year. But there was one final lesson that made everything work together. It was a habit so simple that most people ignore it completely. Yet, once I adopted it, the soil stayed healthier for much longer, and the plants rewarded me throughout the growing season. The final lesson was so simple that when I first heard it, I almost laughed. I expected some hidden ingredient or a complicated gardening trick. Instead, the advice was to spend a few minutes every week simply observing the soil and the plants before doing anything else. Most gardeners walk straight to watering or feeding because they want to help immediately. I used to do exactly the same thing. The problem is that when you act before you observe, you often solve the wrong problem. The older gardener who taught me this Korean method would slowly walk through his containers and look closely at the soil surface. He would notice whether it stayed moist too long or dried too quickly. He would check whether the leaves looked relaxed or stressed. He paid attention to small changes long before they became serious problems. At first, this seemed too simple to matter. Then I started doing it myself. What surprised me was how many mistakes I avoided. Sometimes a pot did not need water, even though I thought it did. Sometimes a plant looked weak because of heat rather than lack of nutrients. By observing first, I stopped making unnecessary adjustments. That alone improved the health of my containers. Here is where things get interesting. The Korean remedy worked best when it became part of a routine rather than a rescue treatment. Many people wait until the tomatoes are already struggling. Then they search for a quick fix. I learned that the real power of this method comes from maintaining living soil before serious problems appear. A small application from time to time, combined with organic material and careful observation, created a stable environment for the roots. Very few gardeners take this approach because it is not dramatic. There is no instant transformation overnight, but season after season, the results add up. The tomatoes become more dependable, the harvest becomes more consistent, the soil becomes easier to manage. One year I compared two nearly identical containers. One followed my old habits, and the other followed the living soil approach. By late summer, the difference was impossible to ignore. The healthier container stayed productive longer and required less effort overall. That was the moment I realized I was not just growing tomatoes. I was building a healthier soil system inside the pot itself. And once that system was working well, everything else became easier. There is one more thing I want to share because it ties all of these lessons together. It may be the most valuable part of the entire story, and it completely changed the way I think about container gardening today. The most valuable lesson I learned from this entire experience is that successful container gardening is not really about finding the strongest fertilizer or the newest product. Creating conditions where the soil can support the plant naturally for as long as possible. But that idea changed everything for me. Before I understood it, I was constantly reacting to problems. I was chasing yellow leaves, weak growth, and disappointing harvests. Every season felt like a struggle. Once I began focusing on living soil, the entire process became calmer and more predictable. The old Korean remedy was only one part of that change, but it opened my eyes to something important. Healthy soil is not just dirt sitting inside a container. It is a living system that needs attention, just like the plants growing in it. When that system is healthy, tomatoes often grow stronger, produce more consistently, and require fewer corrections throughout the season. What I appreciate most is how simple and affordable this approach can be. Many gardeners over 50 are looking for methods that do not require constant spending or complicated schedules. This method fits perfectly because it relies on observation, patience, and a few inexpensive materials. You do not need special equipment. You do not need to follow complicated instructions. You simply work with the soil instead of fighting against it. Looking back, I realized that many of the problems I blamed on weather varieties or bad luck were actually signs that the soil needed help. Once I started restoring life below the surface, the plants responded in ways that surprised me. The harvest improved. The containers stayed productive longer. Most importantly, gardening became more enjoyable because I spent less time worrying and more time harvesting. If you have a few tomato plants in pots and they are not performing the way you hoped, then consider starting with the soil before buying anything new. Sometimes the solution is much simpler than it appears. A very few people talk about these older methods today, but that does not mean they have lost their value. In many cases, they continue working because they focus on basic principles that never change. I still use this approach every season, and I continue learning new things from it. Every container tells a slightly different story. Every season brings new observations, and that is one reason I keep coming back to the garden year after year. The more attention I give to the life inside the soil, the more the soil gives back. And once you see that for yourself, you may never look at a simple flower pot the same way again.